Every nation on earth carries debt. It is a simple sentence, almost boring in its familiarity. Yet behind those words lies a crisis so vast, so structurally embedded, so invisible, that even world leaders can barely describe it. The United States owes over $38 trillion. Japan owes more than $9 trillion. Europe collectively owes trillions more. Add every government, every corporation, every household, and the total climbs to a number so large that it collapses comprehension. $315 trillion in global debt. But the paradox is not the size of the number. Numbers have grown before. Economies expand, populations rise, currencies inflate. Large figures alone do not make a crisis. The true mystery is something else, something almost philosophical. If every country owes money, then who is the world indebted to? And why does the debt never go away? This is not a rhetorical question. It has an answer, but not the answer most people expect. When you trace the chain of creditors, when you follow the flows of money, when you examine the architecture built over 3 centuries, you discover something startling. The world does not owe money to an external force. It owes money to itself. Debt has become the bloodstream of the global economy, not a temporary condition, but the permanent state of modern civilization. It circulates, compounds, expands, and renews itself like an organism with no natural endpoint. And this is not an accident. 4 men, living in different centuries, solving different problems, each contributed a structural innovation that locked the world into a system where governments borrow forever, debt becomes money, interest flows upward eternally, and escape becomes mathematically impossible. What follows is a deep dive into how this system was constructed, step by step, decade by decade, crisis by crisis. This is not conspiracy. This is documented history. The contracts exist. The institutions remain. The mechanisms still operate every single day. If you truly want to understand how power works, how nations are controlled, how wealth rises and never falls, and why no government can ever pay off its debt, you must begin at the origin, the moment debt transformed from a temporary inconvenience into a permanent feature of the modern world. Before the trap, an age of simple debts. Before the 1700s, debt was a basic transaction. Kings borrowed money from wealthy merchants or nobles, usually to finance wars or royal projects. They agreed to repay with interest, and sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Default was common, often seen as a negotiating tactic. The key point is this: debt cleared. It reset. It disappeared. If a king defaulted, the creditors lost money, the monarchy lost reputation, and the system returned to zero. There was risk, but the system was finite. Debt did not yet have the power to shape nations or control governments. It had not become structural. That would change in a single stroke, in a moment of desperation, during a war that England could not afford. The proposal that changed the world, 1694. In the late 1600s, England was locked in conflict with France. War consumed resources at a terrifying rate. The treasury was empty. Tax revenue could not keep up. Traditional lenders refused to provide more credit because England had defaulted before. In this crisis stepped a Scottish merchant named William Paterson, a man whose earlier ventures had failed, but whose imagination had not. He presented the king with a proposal that sounded almost too good to be true, and in many ways it was. Paterson offered to organize a syndicate of wealthy merchants willing to lend the government £1.2 million, an enormous sum in that era. But the innovation, the radical twist that would rewrite financial history, lay in the repayment terms. Paterson proposed that the loan would never need to be repaid. only the interest would be paid. Forever. This was an entirely new form of borrowing. Until then, loans had endpoints. Debts eventually matured and were repaid or defaulted. But Patterson proposed a permanent loan, one that would become a fixture of the state itself. In exchange for this perpetual interest stream, Patterson proposed the creation of a new institution, the Bank of England. This was not merely a bank. This was the prototype for the modern central banking system, and the details of its design would change the logic of the global economy. Here's how the mechanism worked. 1. Wealthy merchants deposited gold into the Bank of England. 2. The bank loaned that gold to the government. 3. The government paid 8% interest per year, funded by taxes. 4. The principal, the £1.2 million, would never be repaid. 5. The bank issued paper notes backed by the government's debt. This last part is crucial. The government's IOU became money. Debt became currency. Currency became debt. The two fused into one system. The more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. National debt was no longer a temporary condition. It became the lifeblood of the financial system. Patterson's innovation built the first wall of the modern debt prison, and the world would never be the same. The explosion of debt as money. Over the next few decades, the implications of Patterson's model rippled across Europe. Nations began issuing bonds not as emergency measures, but as permanent fixtures. These bonds became the basis for new banking institutions, new credit markets, and new forms of money creation. 3 important transformations occurred. 1. Debt was no longer meant to be repaid. It was meant to be managed, rolled over, and expanded. 2. Debt became a tradable asset. Bondholders could sell government IOUs in a growing financial marketplace. 3. The money supply became tied to government borrowing. In this new world, if you reduced debt, you reduced money. Debt had become structural, necessary for economic functioning, and soon, one family would take this system and expand it across borders, weaving a web so interconnected that no nation could ever escape. The Rothschild Revolution, 1815. By the early 1800s, Europe was bruised and exhausted from the Napoleonic Wars. Nations needed funding on a scale far beyond what traditional lenders could provide. Into this landscape stepped Nathan Rothschild, one of 5 brothers who operated banking houses across the continent. The Rothschilds had something no one else had: a continental network, lightning-fast courier systems, unmatched access to capital. The ability to move money across borders instantly. Nathan Rothschild's innovation was simple yet transformative. He industrialized sovereign debt. Instead of lending directly to governments, he bought government bonds at a discount and sold them to investors around Europe. This created an international secondary market, something that had never existed at scale. But with this innovation came something darker: the web that eliminated default. Before the Rothschild era, if a king defaulted on his debts, the creditors suffered, but the crisis remained local. The system reset. But once government bonds were tradable across borders, everything changed. Now, a British bond might be owned by a French investor. That investor might borrow from a German bank using the bond as collateral. The German bank might then lend to an Austrian businessman who spent the money in Italy. In this new world, if Britain defaulted, the entire web collapsed. Default was no longer a financial event. It became a geopolitical earthquake. Governments became trapped. They could not default because the consequences would ripple across the continent, threatening political stability, banking systems, and international relations. By the 1820s, the Rothschilds controlled the sovereign debt markets of Europe. No nation could raise money without them. No default could occur without risking continental panic. Nathan Rothschild had constructed the second wall of the global debt prison, a financial empire built on interest. By mid-century, the Rothschilds were the wealthiest family in the world. Their wealth did not come from manufacturing, agriculture, or trade. It came from a single source: interest on sovereign debt. This was the purest form of financial power imaginable. They controlled the issuance, movement, and trading of government IOUs, the very blood vessels of modern economies. But across the Atlantic, a new power was rising. America was growing, industrializing, and expanding rapidly. Yet its financial system was unstable and primitive. It lacked a central bank, lacked unified regulation, and lacked a mechanism for managing national debt on a long-term basis. That solution would arrive in the form of another titan of finance, one whose influence would reshape the 20th century. Enter J.P. Morgan, 1907 to 1913. The early 1900s, United States was a land of opportunity, but also of risk. The economy surged forward, then collapsed in waves of instability. Bank failures were common. Panics could devastate entire regions. In 1907, disaster struck again. A financial panic froze markets, crushed stock prices, and crippled banks. There was no central authority capable of stabilizing the system. Only one man had enough power to act: J.P. Morgan. Morgan summoned the heads of major New York banks, locked them inside his private library, and refused to let them leave until they agreed to fund a multi-million-dollar rescue package. It worked. The panic ended. The system stabilized. But Morgan knew something fundamental. The next crisis might be bigger. He would not be alive to orchestrate the next rescue. America needed a permanent mechanism. So Morgan and his allies, senators, bankers, industrialists, secretly crafted a plan. That plan became the Federal Reserve System. The secret birth of the Federal Reserve, 1910 to 1913. In 1910, a small group of powerful men traveled to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Their identities were concealed. Their mission was top secret. For 9 days, they drafted the blueprint for the most powerful financial institution in the world. The public was told the Federal Reserve would decentralize power, stabilize the economy, democratize finance. But in reality, the structure ensured one thing: Wall Street would control the creation and distribution of money. The Federal Reserve had the authority to purchase government bonds with money it created electronically. This innovation completed the transformation begun by William Patterson over 2 centuries earlier. Now, governments no longer had to worry about finding lenders. The Federal Reserve itself would always buy their debt. And with that, debt became infinite. Morgan had built the third wall of the financial prison: the consequences of infinite debt. Once the Federal Reserve was created, a new era began. Governments no longer borrowed from limited pools of wealth. They borrowed from a machine capable of creating money at will. This meant the government could never run out of lenders. The national debt could grow without practical limits. Interest payments became structural, permanent, built into the budget. Taxpayers would fund those payments for generations. By the 1970s, nations around the world had adopted similar systems. Central banks became the engines of money creation and bond purchasing. But there was still one problem. What happens when a country cannot pay its debts? The age of rising inflation and the coming storm, 1970 to 1979. By the mid-1970s, the global economy had entered a period of turbulence unlike any seen in modern history. Inflation was rising rapidly across the United States, Europe, and developing nations. Prices surged, Wages struggled to keep pace, and governments fought desperately to stabilize their currencies in the face of oil shocks, geopolitical conflicts, and the lingering effects of decades of monetary expansion. This era exposed the vulnerabilities created by centuries of financial innovation. The structural foundations laid by William Patterson, Nathan Rothschild, and J.P. Morgan, permanent debt, globalized bond markets, and central banks capable of creating money at will, were now being tested under extreme pressure. The financial engine built over 300 years depended on confidence. Yet confidence in the U.S. dollar, the world's anchor currency, was eroding. Inflation above 10% threatened the stability of the entire system. Investors began losing trust, markets grew volatile, and policymakers found themselves confronting an existential dilemma. Tighten monetary policy and risk recession, or allow inflation to spiral and risk collapse of the monetary order. It was in this storm that Paul Volcker emerged, a man whose decisions would reshape the global debt system forever. Paul Volcker's shock therapy. When Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, he inherited an economy drowning in inflation. Volcker believed that inflation, if left unrestrained, would destroy public trust in money and destabilize the global financial system. To him, inflation was not merely an economic problem. It was a threat to the long-term survival of the monetary architecture that held the world together. Volcker's remedy was drastic. He raised interest rates to unprecedented levels, pushing the federal funds rate from around 11% to nearly 20%. Borrowing costs exploded. Mortgage rates soared. Businesses struggled to finance operations. Households were crushed under credit burdens they could no longer bear. The United States entered a deep recession. Unemployment spiked. Factories closed, and public anger rose sharply. Yet Volcker stayed the course. He believed that restoring confidence in the dollar required breaking the back of inflation, no matter how painful the short-term consequences. His policy worked. Inflation collapsed. The dollar strengthened. But while America absorbed the shock, developing countries that had borrowed heavily during the 1970s suddenly found themselves unable to service their debts. Volcker's action had set off a chain reaction that would change the global order. The developing world collapses under the weight of high interest. Throughout the 1970s, banks based in the United States and Europe aggressively lent money to developing nations. Many governments, encouraged by optimistic forecasts and eager to modernize their economies, borrowed billions in U.S. dollars to fund infrastructure projects. But once Volcker raised interest rates, the burden of these loans skyrocketed. The cost of servicing dollar-denominated debt tripled almost overnight. Export revenues could not keep up, and in 1982, Mexico became the first major country to admit that it could not make its debt payments. It owed $80 billion it could no longer service. Brazil followed. Argentina followed. Dozens of nations faced the same crisis. The problem was not merely that these countries owed money. The problem was that the biggest creditors were American financial giants, whose balance sheets were now at risk. If Mexico defaulted, banks like Citibank, Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan would suffer catastrophic losses. Some might fail entirely. And if those banks failed, the shock could cascade through the global financial system. In a world interconnected by Rothschild's bond markets and supported by Morgan's central bank structure, a single sovereign default now posed systemic risk. Something had to be done. And what happened next revealed the true function of the debt system. The IMF steps in, the new global debt enforcer. When Mexico declared it could not pay, the world looked to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF stepped forward, offering a solution, but not the one Mexico expected. Instead of forgiving or reducing debt, the IMF provided new loans specifically so Mexico could continue paying interest on the old loans. The funds did not go to improving Mexico's economy or supporting its citizens. They went directly to the banks that had issued the original loans. This was a bailout of the lenders, not the borrower. In exchange, Mexico and later Brazil, Argentina, and many others were forced to accept strict austerity measures known as structural adjustment programs. These programs required governments to cut public spending, privatize state-owned assets, open markets to foreign investment, and devalue their currencies. These changes reshaped entire economies, often weakening domestic industries and reducing national sovereignty. Despite these sacrifices, the debts did not shrink. They grew larger. The purpose of IMF intervention was not to help nations escape debt. It was to ensure interest payments continued to flow. Volcker's interest rate shock had transformed the IMF into the world's debt enforcer, guaranteeing that no country could simply walk away. The fourth pillar of the debt trap was now in place. Debt without exit. By the mid-1980s, it became clear that nations were no longer fully sovereign in financial matters. Their ability to make independent economic choices was constrained by the need to service debt that could neither be repaid nor defaulted upon without risking global economic instability. A government might control its laws, its schools, its infrastructure, and its elections. But when it came to financial policy, the real power lay with creditors, central banks, and international institutions. The mathematics of the debt system imposed strict rules. A nation could not repay its debt without collapsing its money supply. It could not default without triggering a financial crisis. It could not stop borrowing because new debt was required to service old debt. And it could not shrink its national debt without causing recession or deflation. Therefore, countries became locked into a cycle of borrowing, rolling over, servicing interest, and repeating the process indefinitely. Politicians changed, parties changed, but the system remained. Debt was no longer an option. It was an obligation. A structural feature, not a temporary circumstance. The trap had fully matured. The rise of the great asset managers. Historically, the beneficiaries of government debt were wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and banks. But in the modern era, a new type of financial entity rose to unprecedented power: the global asset manager. Companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street now control tens of trillions of dollars. They manage pension funds, retirement portfolios, insurance reserves, and massive institutional investments. When governments issue bonds, these firms are among the largest buyers. They hold the obligations of nations. They collect the interest funded by taxpayers. They influence financial markets, shape corporate governance, and even guide economic policy indirectly. When governments pay interest on their debt, that money ultimately flows to investors represented by these asset managers. Pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, hedge funds, banks, and wealthy individuals all receive a share of these payments. This represents the largest continuous wealth transfer in human history, silent, automatic, and perpetual. Interest payments are not labeled as taxes, but their effect is identical. Money flows upward from the public to financial institutions. The debt machine enriches those who own the bonds while binding the rest of society to the system.